Continuing that. Senator Kelly just mentioned the possibility of our industry kind of working together and participating in the Ships for America Act, and we're very fortunate to have our next speaker with us today, Sal Mercogliano, if I could call him to the stage. Sal, I think, is known to most of you here. He is a professor of history, but also is the founder of a website, probably the website with the most followers. How many, Sal? 525,000 followers that really exploded in popularity after the incident in the Suez Canal in 2021. The YouTube channel is called What's Going On with Shipping, and it's a pleasure to have Sal with us to walk us through both the Ships for America Act and also what's happening in the USTR's office. Sal, welcome.
Thanks, Sal. Appreciate it. Good. Well, good morning. I want to thank Marine Money for the invite to come up here in my first year up here, and obviously it's on a sad occasion, but I am looking forward to being here for the next 3 days and participating. I was asked to talk about the Ships Act, the USTR, and its role with two issues. Basically, how did we get here and its influence on U.S. and international shipping? Well, let me give you the situation in world shipping. We're seeing right now freight markets frozen, capital stagnate. We're seeing disruptions on the high seas. War risk insurance has skyrocketed. Shippers are holding orders. U.S. exports have stopped moving and markets are in turmoil. Port congestion is spreading to the roads and the rail. And the Treasury Department has just reported, quote, "Our ocean facilities are in the hands of others, subject to war risk and control by interest, not our own. Freight rates are 3 to 5 times normal." That is not an update on the situation in 2025. That's 1914. That is a summation taken from Charlie Papvia's great book on the Jones Act, talking about the way the United States found themselves in 1914, looking at a massive disruption that was taking hold across the world's oceans. And in many ways, the parallels exist today on the same way. As the senator was just talking about, we're seeing a new plethora of legislation and rules coming out that are affecting U.S. maritime industry, probably the most significant changes any of us have ever seen. We're looking at the Ships Act, just explained by Senator Kelly. We're looking at the U.S. Trade Representative's Section 301 report, a report on China's targeting of the maritime logistics and shipbuilding sectors for dominance. We have a White House executive order restoring America's maritime dominance. You'll see that phrase dominance used there quite a bit. Taken as a whole, this kind of represents a Merchant Marine Act for 2025, something we haven't seen in 55 years. Got to go back to 1970 to find something like that. And I'll add on to what Senator Kelly was talking about there on this dominance. The Chinese are very unique. They're not new. We have seen what are referred to as thalassocracies across history. You can go back to the Phoenicians, the Athenians, the Dutch, the Venetians, the British. We've seen these exist before, these maritime empires that exist. China was one for quite a long time, 13th, 14th century, the voyages of Zheng He. But what we're seeing today is a little bit different. That maritime dominance executed by China today isn't the typical kind of horizontal integration we learned in Econ 101. It's vertical integration. They're dominating on all aspects of ocean shipping. The Chinese are not capitalists, they're not communists, they're almost mercantilistic. One of the best analogies for looking at China today is the British East India Company of the late 1800s. So that puts us in a very unique position here. And what I wanted to do today is talk just a little bit about the history of how we got to where we are today. We're going to be talking with panels and discussions about everything going on today and, more importantly, what's going on in the future. But I'm just going to take a few minutes to take you back into the past a little bit and discuss why there are issues that we should be thinking about as we go forward. So how did the U.S. get here? The U.S. for a long time had to debate its identity. It's not new. The U.S. identity crisis is not unusual. We've been doing it for a long, long time. Are we a continental nation or are we a global nation? And it's in 1893 where a historian, I'm a historian, so we always look at this speech given by Frederick Jackson Turner at the World's Fair in Chicago. It's the most historic speech by a historian given perhaps until today, but we'll see. But he gave this speech where he talked about the idea that the frontier has closed, meaning that in 1890 there was no discernible frontier left in the United States, which meant that the U.S. frontier is now outside. And the U.S. is going to go out and challenge the world. At that same moment, the British have claimed dominance on the world's oceans. 2/3 of the merchant marine out on the high seas at the turn of the 20th century are British. They control the key choke points around the world, except for the Panama Canal. They're vital for the British because of coaling stations, because coal is the fuel you use to power vessels. And the British have that. And British dominance is not just in the economic side, it's in the military side. We see that through Nick Lambert in his book, Planning Armageddon, where literally an entire aspect of the Royal Navy and the British military is looking at how to wage economic warfare against its opponents. The British Navy never wants to use its fleet against another fleet. They would much rather use their merchant marine, their economic resources to battle against them. And so Nick talks about that in his book. And it's in this situation that the world slowly descended into a global conflict. Chris Clark, in his book Sleepwalkers, is kind of the modern interpretation of Barbara Tuchman in The Guns of August, where she takes a look at, or Chris takes a look at how Europe eventually descended itself into war, small regional wars that eventually blew up into a much larger conflict with kind of weird perspectives and eerie, ominous for us today. So the situation that the U.S. found itself in at the dawn of the 20th century, much like we find ourselves in the beginning of the 21st century, was one where the U.S. did not have economic dominance. It was broaching out into the international market where there was a vast competitor for it to face off against. And what the U.S. found was an opportunity when World War I broke out. Now, the U.S. did what the U.S. does in world wars. We kind of sit it out till we're ready to get in and can be really the key winner there. So as in World War I and World War II, we don't quite jump in, but in 1914, as I talked about in the beginning, the U.S. found itself really at the mercy. Most of our international commerce was sailing on British ships, and if it wasn't on a British ship, it was on a German ship. Well, the British and German ships flock away in 1914. And so the U.S. finds itself in a very difficult position. Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, very controversial president who has a lot of historiography behind him, saw an opportunity for the U.S. to become a dominant economic power, particularly in the Americas. Jeffrey Safford, in his great book, Wilsonian Maritime Diplomacy, talks about how Wilson all of a sudden had a forward projection for the United States, and he saw an opportunity. In 1916, he has Congress pass through two laws simultaneously. One is the Shipping Act. The Shipping Act is going to get the U.S. building ships. The U.S. had an extensive merchant marine in 1916, but it was basically in the coastal trade. It was handling movement of goods both internally in the United States and along the coast, particularly with the use of the brand new Panama Canal, opened up in 1914. And then a naval act that was going to build a navy to protect that merchant marine. The idea was to build a navy second to only one, and that is to the British. The acknowledgement was the U.S. was not going to be much larger. And so the U.S. kicked off this massive shipbuilding program. This quote here is from Edward Hurley. Edward Hurley is probably a name you've never heard of. He was the head of the U.S. Shipping Board, not the very first to head the shipping board, but comes in eventually. And Edward Hurley, who writes a very famous book, The Bridge to France, will talk about how the U.S. will shift. It will go from its purposes and policy of the shipping board to create a fleet to rebuild the United States merchant marine to one that overnight has to shift its entire focus to support the United States when it enters the war. In February 1st of 1917, the Germans initiate the second period of unrestricted submarine warfare. 10 merchant ships are sunk, 64 merchant mariners are killed. When President Wilson goes before a joint session of Congress on April 2nd, 1917, he puts before Congress a resolution for war, really the last time the U.S. ever debates whether it's going to go to war. And the issue he lays isn't the Zimmerman telegram. It's not inflaming Mexico to invade the United States. That's not going to do it. What's going to cause it, and if you read Wilson's speech, what he talks about all the time is the threat to U.S. trade and U.S. sovereignty. It's the sinking of American ships on the high seas that promotes this. And now Wilson has to initiate a massive shipbuilding program. And Edward Hurley, as the head of the U.S. Shipping Board, with the creation of what's called the Emergency Fleet Corporation, will build the second largest fleet in American history. They will build a fleet, 3,282 ships, most famously in shipyards that exist around the United States, but more importantly, they will build new shipyards, prefabrication yards, yards that will use the policies and procedures that become famous in World War II. We do them in World War I. Most famously, the Hog Island facility up in Philadelphia, the site of the modern-day Philadelphia International Airport. Now, World War I serves as a great test for the United States. It comes out of World War I with a massive merchant marine. The shipbuilding program that was initiated was substantial, over 3,000 ships. However, the ships were of a mixed batch in quality. We've had some concrete-built ships. We even had some wooden ships that were built. But in particularly, the ships and the scale by which the U.S. shipyard infrastructure could ramp up was impressive. We went from building 24 ships in 1914 to building over 600 ships just 5 years later. And the scope and scale of the U.S. shipbuilding industry scared one nation in particular, and that was the British. This was seen as being a challenge. The ships being built by the U.S., which were of a mixed quality, but there were some absolute innovations in technology, and particularly oil-fired boilers. Oil-fired meant that our ships could range farther and longer without needs to stop, which meant we didn't need coaling stations like the British. And that meant that U.S. ships could start challenging the British on the high seas. And ships like the Dollar Line, Robert Dollar out in the Pacific, start coming out in large numbers. And it leads to the U.S. really wanting to develop a policy. And we do that. The Merchant Marine Act of 1920, commonly known as the Jones Act, you would think consists of just one section, which is the cabotage section, Section 27. Yet I will make the argument till I'm blue in the face, especially to some members of those who oppose the Jones Act, that the Jones Act was in truth a national maritime policy that consisted of many sections that looked at international rates and rate stabilization. It looked at shipbuilding. It looked at government oversight. It looked at training. It was a holistic maritime policy that was aimed to put the U.S. out on the high seas to challenge, in particularly, the British. And it was one of the sub-issues that happened a few years later at the Washington Naval Conference, where the U.S. decides, along with the British and other nations, to limit the size of fleets, both in terms of military, but also in commercial. When President Harding comes in, the Republicans comes to power. President Harding's platform was a return to normalcy. Get the U.S. out of government shipbuilding. He wanted to end it. And so it's nice to hear a president talk about normalcy. So Harding comes in with this idea of a return to normalcy. And in the interwar years between World War I and World War II, the U.S. kind of holds a very unique position. Its merchant marine bounces between position of second and third in the world. It establishes itself on some key routes. There's some efforts to build. However, the problem is the U.S. had overbuilt. It had flooded the market with ships at the end of World War I. And an attempt to increase ships through the Merchant Marine Act of 1928 saw the construction of passenger liners, something that was sorely missing from the U.S. merchant fleet. But then you have the Great Depression hit. And the Great Depression all of a sudden sucks all the money out of shipping. There's not a lot of incentive, so that by the time you get into the mid-30s, that fleet that had been built at the end of the 1910s into the early 1920s is aging out. there needs to be an effort to rebuild that fleet and prepare it for a much larger conflict that appears to be heading our way. And that's where you get the Merchant Marine Act of 1936, sometimes referred to as the Magna Carta of U.S. shipping. The Merchant Marine Act of 1936 was really the first in a series of acts that starts revitalizing U.S. maritime infrastructure. The Merchant Marine Act of 1936, the Naval Act of 1938, the Emergency Construction Bills of 1940 that lead you to the construction of the Liberty ships and the two ocean navy, all of that was predicated on returning the U.S. to being a commercial shipbuilder. The originator of the Merchant Marine Act of 1936, Schuyler Otis Bland, congressman from New York, was working alongside, secretly at the time, but very openly now we know, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States. Roosevelt had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. He had seen issues with the shipbuilding program getting started too late in World War I. Hog Island, for example, that's going to build over 100 ships. The very first ship doesn't go down the slipway until the end of the war. And so included in the Merchant Marine Act of 1936 are two key provisions. Section 5, called the Construction Differential Subsidy. This is going to offset the higher cost to build ships. Yes, even in 1936, it's more expensive to build ships in the U.S. than anywhere else. So we're going to offset that with a differential subsidy. And then Section 7, which is the private charter operations, which allows the U.S. government to start building ships under its own dime with a pool of money that is set aside for it, a corpus, and it's going to start building ships and then leasing them to shipping firms. The plan is to build 500 ships across 10 years, 50 ships a year. This program from 1937 to 1945 will net 5,777 ships. It will be the system that ramps up, that builds the two ocean navies. So for example, when SS America, the very first ship in the program, heads down the slipway at Newport News in 1939, right behind it will be built USS Indiana, a battleship, then USS Yorktown, an Essex-class aircraft carrier you can go see down in Charleston today. This shipbuilding program will make it possible so that the arsenal of democracy can be brought from the home front to the battlefront. And it puts the United States in a position at the end of World War II where the U.S. is sitting upon the world's largest Navy and the world's largest merchant marine. It is transporting 63% of the world's ships. And the U.S. is on the precipice of being that thalassocracy, this massive seaborne empire that controls economies, it controls trade. It is in an amazing position, but the most amazing thing is that the U.S. surrenders it. The U.S. decides to give up that position, at least on the high seas. While the U.S. will maintain a large Navy, a series of decisions are made that witness the dismantling of the U.S. Merchant Marine. Many people will hear that the reason the U.S. Merchant Marine is 22nd in the world today is because of the Jones Act. I would argue that has almost nothing to do with it. Instead, a series of decisions are made where we see this happen. In 1946, the U.S. decides to sell 1,113 ships to repopulate the merchant marines of our allies, make sure that our allies' fleets have ships. The Greeks, the Norwegians, the British, the Italians, the French will buy ships to repopulate their fleet until they can rebuild them. The Marshall Plan allows them to set up shipyards in their countries, rebuild, and more importantly, build shipyards that embrace that new prefabrication technology that was made commonplace by the likes of Henry J. Kaiser. The Liberian Registry comes into being after the U.S. had used the Panamanian Registry during World War II to get around neutrality laws. So you see the advent of these open registries. The General Agreement on Tariff and Trades, GATT, comes in, which lowers the U.S. tariff. It was okay for countries to throw tariffs up against us, but we decide to literally lower our tariffs to the lowest level in our history at that point to promote trade with other countries. They're free to get goods from us, and they can charge us a tariff, much different view than the current government has on an issue like tariffs. The interstate highway and pipeline system, what kills the U.S. coastal fleet? It's the Colonial Pipeline, and it's the interstate highway system. more than anything else. And then a series of shipping acts, the 1970 Merchant Marine Act, which fails to produce the 300 ships in 10 years it promised because of issues with technology and funding, and then a series of acts, the 84 and 98 Act, that diminish regulation and oversight of international trade, the decision by the US government to end the construction differential subsidy in the 80s, to build the 600-ship Navy in the US shipyards and move US shipbuilding overseas. All of these contribute to the decline of the US shipping industry. And in his most recent book, Nick Lambert, in The Neptune Factor, talks about how Alfred Thayer Mahan, the proponent of sea power, actually talked about a well-rounded sea power. He makes the argument that the US Navy's view of sea power today is that of military and naval application, when in truth, the true definition of sea power is military, but also commercial application. Basically, one of the things we've seen is that the Chinese have embraced Mahan all around, whereas we only focus on a small concept of it. And that brings us back to where we started with, and talk about the visibility and the issues with this. You heard Senator Kelly talk about the concept of 250 ships. You heard the idea about cargo preference, about shipbuilding. I would tell you that today there is more visibility on shipping than ever before. You heard my YouTube channel. I've got 500,000 subscribers to my YouTube channel, 100 million views, 10 million hours of listening to me, which boggles my wife. My wife does not understand that at all. People are not tuning in to me to see this. This is not the reason. They're tuning in because they want to hear about shipping. They are fascinated and interested in that because there's an awareness of shipping due to tragedies like the Ever Given, like the Dali, like the supply chain crisis, like the Houthi, than ever before. But it raises some fundamental questions about whether or not this current slate of the Merchant Marine Act of 2025 can be successful. Does the U.S. have the will to do this? In both cases where we saw massive shipbuilding, it was because of world wars. Is there sufficient genesis and emphasis to go ahead and do that today? Who's going to be in charge? You heard Senator Kelly talk about the idea of a national maritime advisor, a czar of shipping. Well, we have different offices today. The Federal Maritime Commission, which is in danger of going down from 5 commissioners down to 4 and eventually down to 3. Will they have restaffing? The Maritime Administration, which right now doesn't have a maritime administrator because we're waiting for a confirmation. Office of Shipbuilding under the National Security Office. Does the U.S. Trade Representative, Section 301 on the port fees, will that provide enough funding to fund shipbuilding, to initiate a shipbuilding program of this scale and size? In both previous massive shipbuilding programs, the World War I and World War II shipbuilding, the U.S. government had to allocate money and resources to it. Is the U.S. prepared to do that? And then and finally, technology. What is the technology that's going to drive it? In World War I, the United States introduced that oil-fired vessels. It made U.S. vessels very unique. Because of the access to oil the U.S. had, because the U.S. was the biggest oil producer during that period of time, we were able to range ships all around the planet. We did not need coaling stations. In World War II, we absolutely nailed prefabrication. The concept that you could build Liberty ships, the very first one was built in 270 days. You eventually get down to 45 days. They build one in 4 days just to demonstrate they can do it. Couldn't pay me to sail on a ship built in 4 days. Somebody forgot something. But they demonstrated how prefabrication can work. What is the new technology that the U.S. can bring to bear? Is it small modular reactors? Is it the fuel source that's going to generate the zero carbon emission that's necessary for the IMO? Because one of the things that we've seen is that the U.S. can be the technological innovator. It was Malcolm McLean, a truck driver, who came up with containerization. It was Daniel Ludwig who comes up with the idea of the supertanker. Mickey Aronson comes up with the idea of the passenger ship. We've seen these ideas come up. And in the past, we've seen the U.S. Surge in shipbuilding. In 1914, as I mentioned before, we built 24 ships. In 1919, it was 680 ships. In 1934, the U.S. is building 2 ships a year. In 1935, we built 2 ships. In 1944, 1,463 ships. So the capability was there. The question is the capability and the resources still here today? And that's what I'm going to sit back and listen to over the next 3 days and enjoy. So thank you very much.